This Gumbands podcast is made possible by the Buell Foundation, serving southwestern Pennsylvania since 1927, and by listeners like you. Thank you.
Please come in. This is a podcast called Gumbands. If you've ever lived around Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, you may know our title. It's a regionalism, a somewhat wacky word that most folks in western Pennsylvania know. A gum band is simply a rubber band. And we all know that word too, but we also often have a bit of pride in our exclusive Pittsburgh vocabulary. And this is going to be a podcast loosely about Pittsburgh, its people, its history, its food, its goofy way of talking, its unusual charms and unexpected connections. And we think the whole thing can best be held together by gum bands. My name is Rick Sebak. I'll be your host, but it's certainly not a one-man show. It's kind of a co-production with my colleague Rich Capaldi, who came up with the idea for this series. We hope we'll have other contributors too. We work at WQED, the public TV and multimedia production house on Fifth Avenue, in what we usually call the Oakland neighborhood of Pittsburgh. Although if you look at the official city neighborhood maps, you will find that we are actually in what is called Squirrel Hill North. And some may say we are technically on the campus of Carnegie Mellon University. We Pittsburghers love our neighborhoods and are fiercely loyal, even when we don't pay strict attention to official government maps. So, this is a Pittsburgh-centric podcast called Gumbands, and today we're going to talk about two books that I loved. One called The Ghost Warriors, and a sequel titled The Battle for the Emperor's Skull. And our guest today is the author of those books, an old friend, Mr. Bill Tippins. I've known Bill, I think, since 2001.
Right. It's been a pretty long time.
And I think you contacted me about your being an amateur archaeologist.
Right.
And I was sort of fascinated by this whole world that he sort of exposed me to.
Mm-hmm.
And I was doing a program called Pittsburgh A to Z at the time. And there were many possibilities for A, but it ended up being amateur archaeologists.
Yeah. And arrowheads, too, kind of rolled in
and arrowheads. And I loved it because it takes us back to the beginning of civilization in our area.
Yeah, true.
And actually, we watched the story the other day, and we'll have it available on our website and all of that, the original story from Pittsburgh A to Z.
Okay.
And we love the fact that the farmer made that connection to think that, oh, I'm touching things that people created 15,000 years ago.
Right. It's mind-blowing.
It is mind-blowing. And it also makes me think about Meadowcroft. Is that the era we're talking about? Is that Stone Age Western Pennsylvania?
Yeah, absolutely. If the books, you mean, the books are a little later than, well, actually not the Meadowcroft. Meadowcroft, I'll give a plug for them. It's one of the oldest, if not the oldest, archaeological site in North America. Hard to believe, right? Here we are in Western Pennsylvania, and it's the oldest site in North America. But it's a rock overhang where people were camping for thousands of years, and it was excavated by Pitt and Dr. Adavasio back in the 70s, and they kept going deeper and deeper and deeper. And with each layer, you're going back in time, which is really cool. So they were going from the present, and they ended up 15,000 years ago, which was about 2,000 or 3,000 years earlier than at that time they thought people were in North America. Now that's been validated at other sites across the continent. But it is mind-blowing that people have been here that long.
Right. And do you have any idea why you got so attached to it, or what it is about you that makes you want to know more about that?
Yeah, I have a story that involves an old friend, Dick George, archaeologist at the Carnegie Museum. And the story goes, I was building a camp, a kind of a fishing camp up in Armstrong County. And I had a bulldozer come in and cut a roadway in. And after a hard rain, I started finding these arrowheads. These were clearly human-made. I mean, it looked like something that had just been dropped there. But I knew no one had been back there but me. And so I picked these things up, and I called the Carnegie Museum because there was an old Indian village at Katanning on the Allegewi River. That goes back to the French and Indian War, which I have an interesting connection to on that. But I called the Carnegie Museum, and Dick George answered. I said, I found some arrowheads. I'm curious. Can you tell me more? He said, bring them on in. So I went into Oakland. He looked at these. He picked up one of them. He said, oh, that's about 4,000 years old. And then he looked at the other one. He said, that's about 8,000 years old. And I was just blown away. I was hooked right then. Because how could something 8,000 years old look like it's just been manufactured? Well, they were using what we call flint, or the technical term would be chert, and that stone doesn't erode. It's hard and brittle, which is why they used it, because of the sharp edges. And so that's how I got started, and then I went on to become a member of the Society for Pennsylvania Archaeology, and I could talk hours about that, but I won't right now.
Well, and somehow I'll continue our personal history. I hadn't heard from you in several years, I don't think. And then last October, you called me and said, hey, I want to talk to you about something. And we met for lunch at Mola, the sushi place in East Liberty.
Right.
And you revealed to me that you'd written a book. And I have to say, I was pretty surprised.
Okay.
And, you had said, if you wouldn't mind, give it a read and, put a review up on Amazon and that kind of thing. And I don't know, I put the book aside. I think I was doing something else. And then eventually when I did pick it up, I was sort of amazed at how much I loved it.
Thank you.
It's really exciting, and it was fun, and it reminded me of Lord of the Rings, and it was nonstop action, and I just thought, wow, I think Bill was meaning this for young readers.
Right.
I'm not a young reader. I'm an old reader, but I was totally charmed.
I'm an old writer. Maybe that's the clue.
How old?
I'm 59.
No. How long have you been writing?
That's my debut novel. Interesting thing, I studied engineering in college, and I took no English classes past high school. So I tell people I have a high school education when it comes to writing, which is true. But that's one of the reasons I think I was attracted to I'll call it young adult books. They call it middle grade or young adults.
Yeah, YA you see all the time.
I guess I'm a little insecure about my vocabulary. I'm no Ernest Hemingway. But when you're writing for a 12-year-old, you speak in simple sentences. And it turns out adults kind of like that too.
And that's your ideal reader, do you think, a 12-year-old?
Yeah, the reason I wrote the book was I think our area, but not just Western PA, the entire world has a very interesting prehistory. Now, prehistory is before written history, so that's the Stone Age. And I obviously, that I know a lot about the prehistory of Western Pennsylvania, which is where the book is kind of set, although I make it vague. But I had an epiphany. I was reading an archaeological report from a German site, and I found out 6,000 years ago, people in Germany were living pretty much identical lifestyle as people here 1,000 years ago. And they were living in fortified circular villages. They were using bows and arrows. They were attacking each other. Unfortunately, there's a lot of evidence, both in North America, Europe, Asia, of conflict between people. And unfortunately, it continues today, right?
Right. It's scary.
Yeah.
And I had so many, I think the books, I don't want to talk about plot just because I think that's what keeps me reading.
Right.
And
you are on to the second book right now.
I'm about 120 pages into the second book.
Good.
I didn't finish it. And then I was really worried about that, but then I thought, it doesn't matter. Because I'm totally enchanted. And I care about the characters. And and you say you didn't have any English or creative writing classes or anything like that. So, how did you start this? You just sat down one day? Do you have what's your procedure?
Well, I've always enjoyed writing, but more technical writing. I've done my share of archaeology. I've written that up. I was editor of the statewide archaeology journal, Pennsylvania Archaeologist. That's just because they couldn't find anybody else that would do the job. That's true. But I ended up editing PhD archaeologist papers. They would submit them to me for publication, and so I became pretty confident in writing, and I just have a passion for this time period, and I feel there's a story that's not being told. And you mentioned Meadowcroft Rock Shelter. I mean, a lot of people still don't know about it. They don't know that people have been here that long. If I can go back to when we first met, the reason I reached out to you, because I was trying to get somebody's attention about the prehistory of our area, because at the Heinz History Center back then, history started in 1750. And we have a wonderful French and Indian War history in this area. It was pretty brutal. I wouldn't say wonderful is the right word. But there's a whole story of thousands of years before that. It wasn't being told. And so I tried to get your attention and say, hey, why don't you talk about this? And you did. We went out on arrowhead hunting in one of those shoots.
Although I think somebody says they're not all arrowheads, they're points.
Yeah, they're actually, most of them are spear points. The arrowhead, or the arrow, bow and arrow, didn't come into this area until about 1,000 years ago. But that's what farmers that find them. And I'm a city boy. I'm third generation Pittsburgher. I didn't find my first projectile point, that's the technical term, until I had that cabin road built in. But if you talk to any farmer, just about anywhere, you ask them, do you ever find arrowheads here? Oh, yeah, my dad or my grandpa had a shoebox full of them. And that's just because people have been here so long. So back to the book, I like to write, and I just thought I wanted to get young people involved in the story. And I mean, you could write a technical report and most 12-year-olds probably aren't going to be interested. But I thought a novel and just some simple characters, and I set it originally in Western PA, which if you look at the maps in the book, you'll recognize the Allegheny River, the Monongahela River, and at the point it's set. And then I kind of expanded it because I wanted it to appeal to readers outside of Western Pennsylvania. And we all have Stone Age ancestors. I don't care what your cultural heritage is. You have ancestors. You have to have. Whether they're in Europe or North America or Asia or Africa, people all went through this stage of development. And people are people. I don't think they behaved, from what I've seen on the archaeology reports, the behavior is very similar on every continent. And so I just decided to try to write a story, and I had to pick a title. And the storyline, I don't honestly remember how the plot came about, but I ended up with our hero and his sidekick, which is Tioga and Kopi. Tioga, by the way, is a county in Pennsylvania. I don't know if you know that.
Well, actually, one of my questions was to tell me how you pronounce all these names, because I thought it could be Tioga or Tioga.
I got it wrong. I thought it was Tioga, but I went to an archaeology seminar just this weekend before last in Ligonier, and an archaeologist was from that Tioga County.
Oh, where is it? Up north?
It's in northern Pennsylvania, north central Pennsylvania, and there's the Tioga River. And I said, okay, it's Tioga. I didn't know.
Oh, that's good. I'm glad to hear that, because I think I probably read the first book just not even worrying about it, because when you're reading, you just see the word. But then
you can pronounce it in your mind however you want.
But I was. Because the bridge collapsed in my neighborhood.
Yes.
I've been trying different routes and everything, and I was driving through Homewood one day, and there's a Tioga Street.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yes, right here in Homewood. So, I just thought, oh, look,
Tioga
this street
Street
is named after that character in the book I'm reading.
You should ask the mailman, how do you pronounce this street?
So no fiction before you started to write this?
Never.
How did you start? How did you do it on a computer? Did you do it longhand?
Well, I have to admit, I was pretty insecure, so I bought some books on how to write a book. And, I just read books, and it turns out there's only so many plots out there. You would know this from film school. I'll bet you they taught you the same thing. I mean,
Actually, I think I probably know it from an English class, which I loved, which was Joseph Campbell's The Hero with 1,000 Faces. Do you know this book?
No, of course, because I don't know literature.
I mean, it's really more about literature, but it's the thing that that Star Wars was based on. That
so many movies are and
Right.
books.
Right. Joseph Campbell, The Hero with 1,000 Faces. When I read it, I absolutely adored it because he explained that all stories are the same story. Sometimes they're just one part of it, but essentially, and I mean, so many of your characters, I say, oh, I know what this character is doing, like the Ganga switch. Is that how you say it?
Yeah, that's
Or Genghis.
Yeah, so since people don't know what we're talking about, I'll tell a little of this plot. Okay, excuse me. Tioga is a 13-year-old boy. He's living on the Allegewi River, which is actually the Native American name for, that was an approximation of Allegheny River.
Say it again, Allegewi.
Right. And so he was living in his village, and he's playing with his best friend, Kopi. And that name I just picked out of the air. I don't know why. And the two of them, the book starts, they're exploring a cave. And they, at the end of the first chapter, they hear a scream. And it turns out a girl is being kidnapped from their village by somebody. And so Tioga and Kopi go try to figure out what's going on. And they encounter the Monongah devil. And that is the villain. And he's an evil warlord. And so it's basically the tale of two cities, except we're talking two villages. One village is on the Allegheny, and one's on the Monongahela. Now, I made that a little more vague for readers that aren't from Western PA. But if you are from Western PA, I think you'd relate to it. And so there's a kidnapping, and the chief's daughter, who Tioga happens to have a crush on, the 14-year-old daughter of the chief, she gets kidnapped. And kidnapping, it's not the most original plot. I mean, there's probably, what's the movie Taken? Is that the one with
Liam Neeson?
Yeah, Liam Neeson. I mean, that plot's been around for a long time. I will mention there is in our family a story of a kidnapping in the French and Indian War. And I knew of it, and so that did influence me. If I don't want to, I want to let you get questions in, but it's a pretty cool story.
No, go ahead.
Hear it? So, if you know Western PA history of the French and Indian War, in 1755, General Braddock was defeated near Kennywood Park over at Braddock, PA. George Washington was with him, and General Braddock was mortally wounded. He died 3 days later. So basically, the French and the Indians that were at Fort Duquesne decimated the English army. At that point, they retreated. The English retreated to the East Coast, and the French and the Indians figured they've got these guys on the run, and so they're going to try to push the European settlers that had been pouring in from the East Coast. And so I think it was my sixth, I'm into ancestry, my sixth great-grandfather was living near Harrisburg in a log cabin with his family. In 1755, in the fall, the French and the Indians were emboldened to go on raids and try to wipe out the settlers, all the way to Harrisburg.
Although the French were settlers themselves.
Yeah, but they were allied with the Indians. Of course, later in the war, they switched sides. Some of the Native Americans would go who, they thought was going to win the war or help them the most. But there was a character named Shingas the Terrible, who was a real-life, you could call him a chief. I think George Washington met him and called him King Shingas. There's a Shingas Street down in McKees Rocks. I don't know if you knew that. And so I didn't really know this, but remember I mentioned I found those arrowheads up near Katanning. Well, that's where Shingas' base was. It was also, he moved around, and a few years earlier he was living at McKees Rocks on the hilltop in a fortified village.
Not close together. I mean,
not
for someone
particularly.
not
It's
from this
kind
area.
of amazing.
That's a hike from
and
McKees Rocks to
Kittanning. And remember, there were in those days horses were probably not that common for the Native Americans, so they were moving on foot most of the time. But this so Shingas, will call him a chief, and he was called Shingas the Terrible because he raided the settlements and was brutal. And him and his war party killed my sixth great-grandfather on my mother's side near Harrisburg. And they kidnapped the children, and they brought them to Kittanning. That's a long walk from Harrisburg to Kittanning.
Yes, it is.
But in the year 1755, this happened over and over again. And there were lots of children that were kidnapped. I think fifth great grandmother of mine, the daughter of the man that was killed, her name was Rebecca Regina Walter, and she was captive for 7 years. Remember the movie Dances with Wolves? And so that kind of stuff happened around here a lot, especially at this point in time of the French and Indian War. So that was, I think, in the back of my head. She, by the way, was exchanged. She lived, there was a raid by Colonel Armstrong on Kittanning, and he killed a number of the natives, but Shingas escaped and moved to Ohio, and my fifth great-grandmother went with him and lived in Muskegon County, Ohio. So
and this, I think, that's something that you often hear, that those children who sometimes were kidnapped into native tribes ended up liking it and became loyal to them.
Or two of her brothers were also kidnapped. One other brother was killed on the journey to Kittanning because the littlest couldn't keep up. I mean, these were brutal times back then. And that happened to her brother. So 7 years later, there was a prisoner exchange, and she was exchanged, as were her brothers that were surviving. One of her brothers didn't like going back to the, English life. They were actually German settlers, but he went back and lived with the Native Americans. So
right, they learned a new language. They learned everything.
7 years. So if you're a kid, I think she came back at 17. She was about 10. So that was in the back of my mind. I said, that's a plot. An evil warlord.
And a character, Shingas.
And that's a real-life character. Now, I said it an earlier time. This story is kind of set in the stone. It's not kind of. It's set in the Stone Age, which around here might be 800 years ago, instead of in 1755. But that kind of was in the back of my mind. So I wanted a hero. You know these formulas. You have a hero, a sidekick, a villain, and a love interest. And those are kind of the four basic characters, which, by the way, most movies have similar characters, if you think of it.
All right, but the book itself, I think, has a publication date of 2021, which is last year. Did you start it in 2020, or did you?
Oh, I actually, it percolated for quite a while. Over a decade. Because what happened, I submitted a manuscript to a publisher locally. I won't name the company. I don't even know if they're still in business. And most authors experience rejection, and so I was rejected. And so I shelved it because I just wasn't into that fight to go. This is a hobby for me. And so then something came along called Amazon and the internet in the meantime. And I know some people aren't into Amazon. To me, it was refreshing because anybody can put anything up without censorship on Amazon. You want to write a book? You can write a book. It might not sell. It's very hard to get traction, to get noticed, because there's a joke. There's more authors on Amazon than there are buyers. But it's been pretty successful. And so I came up back to the title of the book. I won't give away too much of the plot, but Tioga and Kopi end up in a near-death experience trying to escape this warlord. And Shingas thinks they've died. And so they decide to try to save their village, which is going to be attacked and destroyed. And they decide to play the part of ghost warriors because he thinks they're dead. And
so do all his men.
And all his men. So they play tricks and kind of scare them because back in those days, and this is true of humans all across the globe, science has kind of changed the way we think. But back 200 years ago or 500 years ago or 1,000 years ago, superstition and belief in spirits played a big part in your daily life. Somebody gave you the evil eye. I mean, you might better go talk to your local priest or witch doctor or whatever and get that curse removed. And so I played into that. So they use ghost warfare to try to stop the attack on their village. And I won't tell you whether they're successful, but I have a feeling
10 years of bubbling. Did you rewrite it before?
Yeah. So there's one other interesting twist. This I had known, but I thought this would be a cool character. So I think it was 1994 in the Italian Alps, some hikers found a body that was melting out of the glacier. And they thought it was a climber from maybe 50 or 100 years before that it had died in a climbing accident. It turned out it was not. It was about a 5,000-year-old corpse eroding out of the ice, melting out of the ice. And this became big news in Europe, all over the world, because it's the oldest mummy, they call him, because they found skeletal remains. But this body still had its skin on it. It still had its clothing. And it turns out it was murder. He was murdered. He was shot in the back by a bow and arrow up on the glacier, which isn't, they call it the oldest murder mystery in Europe. They still don't know to this day exactly how he died, but they named him Otzi, the Iceman.
Say it again.
Otzi. I call him Otzi, O-T-Z-I. But if you're
as an umlaut.
Umlaut. And so my brother who speaks German said, I think it's Otzi is the correct.
Otzi.
And so I decided to make him a character. And so so the idea of that was because he's kind of a cool, intriguing figure, real-life historical figure that scientists he's been featured in National Geographic. And
from the same era, 1,000 years ago, did you say?
It's about 5,000 years ago in what they call the late Neolithic in Europe, which was very similar lifestyle. Metal was first coming into use, but he still had his bow and his arrows and his flint arrow tips. So I rolled him in because I thought, well, I'm of European descent, and I want a reader, whether you're of Native American descent or African descent or Asian descent or European ancestors, to realize your ancestors lived this way. So in the story, the topography looks like Western PA, but the lifestyle is kind of universal Stone Age. And so he is a big character in the book, too. And I won't say what happens, but there's a second book called The Battle for the Emperor's Skull. So I used the Ghost Warriors series, and the Emperor's Skull is actually based on McKee's Rocks. And we can talk about that if you're interested.
I'm interested just because I know McKee's Rocks also has this. I mean, McKee's Rocks had a mound, and we know that there were ancient people there. They're really people before the people we would call Native Americans.
No, I would call them Native Americans, First Peoples. That's the people that came from Beringia across either the land bridge or by sea from
Asia.
From Asia, and they
and somehow they got to Western Pennsylvania
very quickly, or very slowly, starting either 20,000 years ago or 15,000 years ago. But they were here definitely by 12,000 years ago, and that I thought that's a cool landmark. George Washington, when he did a survey into this area, he said there's a perfect place for a fort. And that was the hill. If you drive across the McKee's Rocks Bridge towards McKee's Rocks, there's a hill. It's got oil storage tanks up on it now. And that was the hill, the promontory. and at the front was a giant rock formation that protruded into the Ohio River, and that was McKee's Rocks. That's what they named McKee's Rocks after. It's since been blown away by mining. People wanted the stone to build their houses. But above the stone cliff, which I took the liberty to make into a carved skull, the emperor's skull. So there's some fun creativity in there, fiction. This is fiction. But there was a fortified village there. It was about 600 years ago, maybe 400 years ago. And George Washington actually met Shingas at the village at McKee's Rocks. And he was negotiating with the various chiefs of the area. So
I was going to say, because I think he also met Queen Allegewi at McKee's Port, or somewhere near there.
I don't know where he met her, but she was around too, and she was a power player of the day. And, the British were trying to convince the Native Americans to come on their side. And the French were trying to say, no, you're going to get a better deal with us. And but I just thought that was a fascinating thing to make that a focal point. So there is a lot of Western Pennsylvania in this series.
You know what? I know that I could keep talking to you about this history because I'm fascinated by all of that. But I'm also interested in actually the process by which you wrote the books. Did you do it all on a computer?
Yeah, I wrote it all myself, did the book covers myself.
And the maps. I mean, they're beautiful.
Oh, thank you.
I mean, I feel like I'm talking to J.R.R. Tolkien or something. I think he did his maps, but I'm not sure.
Well, I love Tolkien. I mean, didn't we all? I mean,
yeah.
In those maps in there. And I hand drew the maps to begin with, but they looked a little cheesy. And so then I found this software program called Incarnate. And it's a little map-making program for people that want to create fantasy worlds. Maybe, I don't know, there's so many fantasy games like spin-offs of Dungeons and Dragons, and they make their worlds. And I said, I could make my maps with this. So I bought a subscription. I forget what it cost. It wasn't expensive. And I play around with it. I make the maps. And I'm an inner 12-year-old. I'm still a 12-year-old at heart at 59. I can still remember what I liked to do at that age, and I loved, if I saw a book with maps, I loved Treasure Island when I was growing up. I mean, X marks the spot.
That's excellent. So, I mean, I'd written this down as a question. Are you Tioga?
It's, yeah, in a way, in a way I'm not. I'm also Kopi. I'm also...
I know that I am totally Kopi. I didn't know whether to call him Kopi or Kopi, but I know I am him.
No, everybody's, they say when you have a dream and you wake up with this vivid dream the next day, and maybe it was very traumatic. I've heard psychologists say, well, you invented the dream in your head. You're all the characters in the dream. Like you may have a part villain that's chasing another part of you that's trying to do something. So I don't see how you could write a song and not have it come out. And when you do your documentaries, it's Rick Sebak. I can feel it. I mean, and so...
Well, I mean, I was also doubly impressed by the fact that you have a website for all of this, tiogaandkopi.com.
Yeah, I did that myself just because I thought I wanted to play this game a little. I had no experience being an author, and but Amazon allows you to cut out the agent and the publisher.
And so, like, you have to you had to pay for a certain run at first, or I mean, like, how do they print them?
No, that's print on demand.
Print on demand.
So you order one, they print one book, which means I make about $1 a book. I mean, it might sell for $10. Amazon does very well.
But when you make the submission, you give them the cover and the maps.
They have a cover creator. I used Photoshop, and I took pictures of my nephews, and then Photoshopped them, added some weight on one, and changed some things on the other. They're not too happy with the changes because it doesn't look like them anymore. But and then I clipped things and put it together. So then I used their cover creator, and it came out pretty cool, I think. If It may not be Barnes & Noble quality, but I think it's held up. People seem to like the covers.
I do. I like the covers, and there's been no follow-up. No publishers come to you and said, "Hey, we really like these books." And
no, I've got.
But they are certainly cinematic as well. Do you think about that?
Yeah, I think. I guess my mind works that way. I picture a scene, and of course, because you come up with ideas creatively. You're picturing what you want to get on camera, and you have to convey that to your producers and things to make it come through. In my case, I have to write it in such a way that I get close to what I'm seeing in my mind to come out. So it's a creative process. It's really fun to write them. I hate to edit them.
You mean like to rewrite?
Oh, my God. The amount of my grammar and my spelling is horrendous.
Yeah, but those can be overcome.
Well, I have hired editors, copy editors, and proofreaders. I learned that on the second book. You should see a lot less typos. The first book, it took me
I don't know that I've noticed any typos, and I'm usually sensitive to that. But I'm always amazed at the speed. Of how fast they move, which I love. I mean, and I think I like that in a movie, or, I would say that they're melodramatic. They're simple. There's a bad guy and a good guy, but it moves with such speed. And I wonder, I mean, do you plan that? Do you know Do you know the plot? Is it an outline, or is it something that you write as you go and you're surprised as you go along?
Well, the first book I outlined, wrote everything out, tried to have a 3-act structure. You would know these terms, and turning points and things like this. And it worked out. But the second book, I was like, when I wrote the first book, I never knew I was going to write a second book. I said, I'll never do that again. That was way too much work. So, but then I got the first one up, and I said, hey, take a shot at the second one. The funny thing on the second one, I did no planning of the plot. You haven't finished it, so you'll have to see if it works. But
so far, so good.
I think it does, and it gets better. It builds. But I woke up, Rick, it was the coolest thing. I did not plan it out. Every day I woke up, a new chapter was downloaded into my head. And I just go type it out.
And do you work mostly in the morning?
Whenever I feel like it. I'm not on a set schedule. So, and I think it works out. And one of the things I try to do is I'm trying to entertain, right, as you do when you do your documentaries. You better do that.
No, I think
right?
I'm so happy to hear you say that, because I think that is something that's sometimes overlooked. Entertainment is part of all this.
Right. If you don't entertain your reader or your viewer, you're going to lose them pretty quick. And then if I can keep their interest, I'm going to try to educate them on how people lived around here, or their ancestors lived in Europe or wherever. And, so...
Well,
and
actually,
I want them to have fun at the same time.
One of the things that surprised me, but I figure you must have based this on some sort of historical evidence, is the amount of folk medicine and, the use of herbs and things for curative purposes. I find that fascinating, and that,
That's
that
where
Kopi takes a little interest in that.
Yeah, he's the son of a doctor or a healer, it would probably be called. And you mentioned a character, I call her the Ganges Witch. And she appears briefly in book 1, or at least speaking of her.
Right.
She's prominently featured in book 2. And she's basically a witch doctor, to use a colloquial term. It's funny, you said, where do you get these names? And I had originally named it the river in India, the
Ganges.
The Ganges. And an Indian friend of mine, actually he didn't take exception to it, but somebody else said, that might be offensive because that's a holy river. And so I changed it from Ganges to Ganges. And then I was looking at a map just the other day, and I see of India, Ganges, and then in parentheses, Ganga, meaning that's their other word for it, holy river.
So you're still
so I still used it without intending to.
But
But she has. By the way, I try to base the storyline in reality, like real things that have happened. It's not all happened to the same people, but a lot of it's based on real life events. And I try to have the characters, when they go through trials, they have to get out of them using the laws of physics. They don't get a magic wand. Nothing against Harry Potter. I love the Harry Potter books. But when she wrote them, she could do things I can't do because I'm operating within the real world. And I kind of look at Tioga as kind of a MacGyver character, where he comes up with creative ways to get them out of fixes. And Kopi is his best buddy and sidekick. And Kopi is more spiritual, and he kind of his intuitive gifts. And so he relates in the second book to Genghis because she's the witch doctor and she's starting to pass on knowledge to him. So, they're a nice yin and yang. One's super logical and the other's kind of emotional and spiritual. And they have to get out of these tight spots. And we haven't mentioned Hannah. I picked a female character. I thought, well, what name should I use? And then I thought, well, Native Americans had the Susquehanna River, and there's the Loyalhanna Creek here in western Pennsylvania. I thought, well, I'm just going to take Hannah off the end because it's kind of a cool name that's still popular, but yet it has historical origins.
Oh, it's funny, when I've gotten into the second book, I wondered if anything had happened as a result of comments from the first book.
No.
Because
I haven't had a lot of them.
The second book has more of a female presence. Not only the Genghis Witch, but Hannah is a bigger character in the second book than she was in the first
she emerges and she's part of the trio in the second book. And, remember the TV series Big Bang Theory? It started with the guys, and then I forget the character name across the aisle. But as that storyline went on, they all started to get girlfriends, and the cast kind of branched out to be more balanced. It's kind of my intent to try to interest young girls or young women in the books as well as boys. I mean, it's equal opportunity. So Hannah emerges, and she becomes a ghost warrior in the second book.
So I know that we could talk on, and I haven't even looked at my questions that I wanted to ask you.
Yeah, you'll have to edit this all down.
No. But what I want you, so if we've enticed someone enough to get the books, they just, how do they do this? How do you find the books?
They're only available on Amazon, and that's because to get into school libraries, it's complicated bureaucracy. To get into bookstores, a different channel, different companies you have to use. So I just went with Amazon, which has about half of the book market right now. And they're doing reasonably well. They're sometimes number one sellers in their categories. Amazon has a lot of categories, and they reevaluate who's number one every hour. So you might be a number one for an hour. Take a screenshot if you are. And, I try not to pump that out too much. Because,
you gave me the first one when we met for lunch last October. But the second one, I thought, I'm going to order just to find out what this is like. Mm-hmm. And literally, I put it in. I think I was there 2 days later. It was on my front porch.
It's amazing.
Yes.
Yeah.
And
so I know some people don't like Amazon, but it's just for a debut author beginning out, it's by far the easiest way. You have connections perhaps to go to a traditional publisher if you wanted to write the Rick Sebak story. But, for somebody starting out, I recommend Amazon. It's worked great.
Well, I can't say how much I, respect and, honor that I have for you, because I think these books are really good.
Thank you.
I just think they're, I would recommend them to anybody, not just kids. I would recommend them to anyone, and the fact that they are set here in this territory that I know a little bit about, I love that, but I understand that it could be anywhere.
Right.
And But I've also always loved the fact that, I think George Washington never calls the point. He calls it the forks, and you call it the forks.
Right, I call it the forks. I worked in the point a little bit later in the second book because I call it the point.
Okay.
Right.
But I've always loved that term, the forks, and, so there's so much to like about these books. I recommend them to anyone, and I thank you for being our guest today.
Sure, thanks for having me. It's an honor.
It's April of 2022 when we're talking here, but we did meet first about these books at MOLA last October.
Right.
I say that, is there going to be a third? Is this a trilogy? Is this an ongoing series? Is it the Hardy Boys? Or
like I said, after the first one, I'd never do this again. And then I wrote the second one, and it was way easier to write. The third one's about half written, and but that's still a long way to getting it out because of my grammar and spelling mistakes, which need to be cleaned up. I have to do almost everything myself, Rick. I've hired some people to help with the copy editing, but it's I think at least 3. We'll see how it goes. I'll tell you one funny story about my nephews that are on the cover. So after I got the first book done, I was kind of excited. It came in the mail from Amazon. I got my books in print, and I went to my nephews and said, "Hey, boys, here's a copy of my book," which they knew I was writing. And they said, "Thanks." I didn't hear anything for a couple of weeks. Then I ran into them about a month later. I said, "Matthew, Max, what did you think of the books?" Matthew hadn't touched it. Max read a little and said, "It's not for me." And so I learned that was a valuable lesson. It's not, and you know this from production. Not everything you do is gonna resonate with everybody. But I do think there's kids out there, and video games is what I'm competing against in a way. But there's nothing better than a good book when you can just relax and read a good book. And I want to see kids know about our history. I want to see kids outside more. I played in the woods a lot, and there's still something about getting off the computer and go out, make a fort in the woods, or go for a hike, or go fishing. And so that's part of my hope, that'll kind of awaken that part. I think it's awake in a lot of kids already, but try to get outside and enjoy nature. And so hopefully that'll help too.
And read a book when you get home.
Read a book when you get home, or bring the book with you.
So there you have it. Some wise advice from Mr. Bill Tippins, and a reminder for me to check out his 2 books, both available on Amazon.com. The Ghost Warriors and The Ghost Warriors: The Battle for the Emperor's Skull. Written for the 13-year-old and everybody, but effective and exciting even for older readers like me. We say big thanks to our guest, Mr. Bill Tippins. We invite you to leave a comment or review on this podcast, and tune in again for another episode of Gumbands, wherever you get your podcasts. Gumbands is made possible by the Buell Foundation and by listeners like you. Thanks.
This Gumbands podcast is made possible by the Buell Foundation, serving southwestern Pennsylvania since 1927, and by listeners like you. Thank you.